Masechet Ketubot, Daf Mem Tet. We are going to see a very important and interesting sugya about the obligation of a father to feed his young daughters. But first, we continue our discussion about the transition between the punishment of chenek, of sikila, to chenek. If a na'ara commits adultery, she receives sikila as long as she is an arusa and a betula and a na'ara. However, once she is married, that's only arusa, she gets sikila. Once she is married, nisu'ah, then she gets the normal punishment for adultery of chenek. At what point does that happen? And it even happens before the consummation of the wedding, and it happens even before the wedding itself. So we learned yesterday that it will take effect, the transition from sikila to chenek will take effect once the woman is transferred from the father or his messengers to the messengers of the husband. And we learn that from Liznot Bet Aviha, that we only apply sikila in Mosi Shemra case if she is under Bet Aviha, if she is still in her father's house. Once the transfer happens, she's no longer in her father's house. So that's what we learned from those words. Now we wonder, wait a second, maybe we could use those words to learn a different law. Maybe those words, Bet Aviha, are coming to teach me that even if she returns to her father's house, in other words, she's married and goes to her husband's house and then is divorced or widowed, and then she returns to live back in her father's house, maybe I would think that she returns to her former state and she would receive sikila once again, should she be an arusa to a second person. And maybe this pasuk is coming to teach us that that in this case she does not go back, even though she's back in her father's house. She does not return to the punishment of sikila, because it says Liznot Bet Aviha, and that says only if she is in the original state of Bet Aviha, not once she leaves her Bet Aviha, even if she goes back. So perhaps the pasuk is coming to exclude this case from sikila, and not the case of the transfer. Rava says, no, we already know this halacha, that if once she leaves, even if she goes back to her father's house, she remains under the punishment of chenek. In the context of annulling vows, says that a father can annul his daughter's vows, a husband his wife's vows. But if someone is an almana or gerusha, then whatever she vows is sustained, because that's it. She no longer is married. Isn't that obvious? She's already not under the authority of her father because she was married, and she's not under the authority of her husband because she's divorced or her husband died. So isn't this obvious that whatever she vows will be sustained, and no one has the authority to annul it? או שמסרו שלוחי האב לשלוחי הבעל ונתערמלה בדרך או נתגרשה. So rather, this pasuk, since we don't need the pasuk for the simple case, must be talking about the following case. If a father transferred his daughter to the messengers of the husband, or his messengers transferred them to the father's messengers, transferred her to the husband's messengers, and she became widowed, or she was divorced while on the way, after the transfer, but before a wedding ceremony. So what's her status? Is she under her father's home, or is she under the authority of her husband? Well, neither. So, because she left her father's home, but now she's no longer married to her husband. Rather, this teaches us that since even for one moment she left her father's authority by being transferred, from then on, the father no longer has authority to nullify her vows. She is the same as a totally married woman who then gets divorced or widowed, who no longer goes back to being under her father's authority. So transfer is sufficient to make her independent for the purpose of vows, and therefore I can derive from this source regarding vows that the same would be true regarding the punishment for adultery, that the punishment for adultery as a na'ara me'orasa betula would be only until the transfer. Once this transfer happens, then even if she changes her mind and goes back to her father's house, or the husband dies and she goes back to live under her father's house and gets engaged again, from then on, that is considered she was already nisu'ah, and so the law of sikila would no longer apply. Okay, Amar Rav Papa. So since we know that, we already have a source for that. Therefore, the pasuk Bet Aviha comes to teach us that not the case. It comes to teach us not the case where she goes back to her father's house, but rather comes to teach us that the transfer itself removes her from betula, removes her from sikila, and transfer to chenek. The context of neder teaches us that even if she goes back to her father's house after such a transfer, she nevertheless remains in her already married status. Amar Papa, afana nami tanena, haba'al na'ara me'orasa eno chayav ad shete na'ara betula me'orasa, v'hi bebet abiha. So the Papa says, I can learn this also from a Mishnah that will back up our conclusion, because the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says that someone who has relations with a Na'ara Me'orasa is only liable if she is a Na'ara, Betula, and Me'orasa, and she's also in her father's home. You need all of those 4 criteria. That's the end of the Mishnah. So we analyze, Bishlama Na'ara v'lo bogeret. Na'ara means, and not over 12 and a half. Betula v'lo be'ula, and not if she has to be betula, not if she already had bi'ah. Me'orasa v'lo nesu'ah, so she has to be engaged currently and not currently married. What's bebet abiha? Lama'ut emai, lav lemut emasar ha'av, l'shlucha habal. So this must come to exclude someone who is already transferred. So even though she's not fully nesu'ah, nevertheless, she's not fully nesua. Nevertheless, the transfer is sufficient to remove her from the law of sikila. Rather, she gets chenek. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, afana nami tanena, and we have yet another Mishnah that confirms this conclusion. Habal eshet ish kevan shenichnesa l'reshut habal lenisuin, af al pi shelo nib'ala, haba alea hare ze bechenek, nichnesa l'reshut habal be'alma shema'mina. So the Mishnah there, in another Mishnah Sanhedrin, says that someone who has relations with a married woman, once she enters into the domain of her husband for marriage, even if they did not consummate the marriage with bi'ah, she already becomes chenek. So you don't need the consummation. Now we analyze nichnesa. She enters into the authority in any way. It doesn't have to be the wedding canopy, as long as she goes into the hands of the husband's messengers. That's already sufficient to remove her from her father's house. And so, in fact, the conclusion that we saw before from Bet Aviha is confirmed. Okay, very good. Now, next Mishnah about the obligations of a father over his young daughter. Ha'av eno chayav bimzonot bito. A basic law is a father is not obligated to provide food for his daughter. Okay, quite amazing. Gemara later on will explain that this is only talking about a daughter who's more than 6 years old, less than 6 years old. He is absolutely obligated legally, but more than 6 years old, he is not legally obligated. Obviously, most fathers want to sustain their kids, but we're talking about a deadbeat father, not around. He doesn't want to, and the question is, at what point and how much can the court rule that he must, and even force him or seize his assets in order to feed his daughter. So according to this Mishnah, father is not obligated. Now, Zeh Midrash Tarash Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Lifnei Chachamim Bekerem Beyavneh. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is the one that took over as the Nasi when they deposed Rabban Gamliel, and he made a derasha before the Chachamim, Habanim Yishuv, Habanot Yizonu. He made a derasha on these words that are found in the Ketubah, standard text of Ketubah, said that sons will inherit, daughters will be fed. Okay, so that's in other words, the husband guarantees his wife that he's marrying that any sons from this marriage will inherit the amount of the ketubah. Should the wife, if he dies first, then she will receive that money herself. But if the wife dies first, then the amount of the ketubah goes to the sons from that marriage, as opposed to maybe other sons that he has from a different marriage. So that's a guarantee in the ketubah, and daughters will be fed from his property. Okay, so now the question is when? While he's alive, after he's dead? So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah made the following and textual analysis. When do the sons get to inherit the amount of the ketubah? Only after the father dies, because it says Yorshin, right? So even though it's not actually a full inheritance, the sons may very well inherit as well. But this is talking about, but the inheritance would have to be split among all of his sons. This is talking about the ketubah amount that his sons from this marriage get exclusively. So, but that happens only after the father's death. So too, since these two phrases are back to back, we make a kind of hekesh and say that the daughters must be fed after the father dies. So yes, once the father dies, then his estate must provide for food for his young daughters, even above 6 years old, until they're married or until they become adults themselves. So that's a derasha. This is very interesting that says the word midrash here, because usually we think of midrash halacha and deriving something from the juxtaposition of two words, as in hekesh. Usually we do that with pisukim from the Torah, and we can derive a halacha from that. We don't usually apply this derasha and this methodology to common texts. And yet here, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is in fact making this derivation from a non-Tanakh, non-prophetic text, simply the text of a ketubah. So there is a lot of discussion about this, whether we are dorshin, lashon hejot, can we make a derasha with regular text or not? So in the fact that he is making one, we can draw a significant possible conclusion that the idea of derasha, of legal derivation, legal exegesis, is not, we do that to the Torah not only because it's a prophetic text, and as a prophetic text it has many layers and all that, but rather we do so as a legal text, because a legal text has to have multiple layers, because any legal document has to answer all possible questions that can come up. A contract has to speak for itself, and even if it doesn't explicitly talk about a certain case that comes up, we have to figure out from any language somewhere in there something that will guide us to solving some question that can come up. So therefore, the authority to draw a legal conclusion based on midrashic methodology, we do in the ketubah because it's a legal document. And so to the Torah is a legally binding document. It's the essence of the berit that both sides agreed to. And so this is really very important in understanding what the midrashim are all about. Another proof for that is the fact that the rabbis treat Agadah and Halacha differently when they learn Midrash Agadah, even from Pisukim in the Torah. They use a different set of methodology than they do for Midrash Halacha, which means that legal derivation is its own world. Okay, more on that a different time. But now the Gemara is going to analyze, and I would like to show in this analysis is that the rabbis themselves were in fact bothered by the morality of the conclusion of this Mishnah that a father is not obligated to feed his daughters. Okay, let's see how this works. Bimzonot bito hu deno chayav. We're going to make two inferences from the Mishnah, since the Mishnah says that a father is not obligated in his obligated chayav for his daughters. So we say, oh, that's only for his daughters. Habzonot beno chayav, but for his sons, he is obligated. If he was not obligated in either one, then it would have mentioned both. Truth is that this entire section of Mishnah talking about the entire Perek of Mishnah is talking about the obligations of a father and husband for his daughter / wife. Not talking about sons at all. So that could be why he's not talking about sons. But nevertheless, at least we can save the sons, and so sons do need to be fed. Bitonameh chovahu deleka misvaika. Now, from the fact that it says that there's no chiyuv, there's no absolute obligation for a father to feed his daughters, but there is a mitzvah, meaning it's a good deed. He should. It's not a legal obligation to the extent that we can force him to do so, but he's strongly encouraged as a positive commandment to feed his daughters. So you see that we're kind of inserting that inference into the Mishnah so that even if there's no full obligation, at least we can get a mitzvah out of it. All right, so with these two inferences in mind that are both not absolutely necessary, but applying a rule of omni significance to the Mishnah that said this specifically to exclude anything else, we ask, Mane Matnitin, who is the author of this Mishnah? It seems that it can't be anyone. Lo Rabbi Meir, Lo Rabbi Yehuda, Lo Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. These are the three candidates because they all have something to say about this in the following Baraita. Let's see what the Baraita is, and we'll see why none of them could be the authors. Tanya, misvah lazon et habanot, kavachomer labanim daske batorah divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir's position is that it's a mitzvah for a father to feed his daughters, and all the more so his sons, because his sons are learning Torah. And since they're busy learning Torah, meaning when they're kids, they're going to school, and so they are not going to be able to engage in work. And so daughters who are not obligated in learning Torah, if it's a mitzvah to feed them, then all the more so sons who have important other obligation. So that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, that there's a mitzvah, but not a chiyuv for either of them. So it can't be Rabbi Meir can't be the author, because while yes, we derived that there's a mitzvah for daughters, we said that there's a chiyuv for sons, and he says it's only a mitzvah for daughters and sons, not a chiyuv. So he doesn't fit with these two inferences. Rabbi Yehuda omed, mitzvah lazon tabanim kavachomer labanot mishum ziluta. Rabbi Yehuda basically agrees with Rabbi Meir that it's a mitzvah for a father to feed both his sons and his daughters. He just derives it in a different, he just makes the kavachomer in a different way, that primarily we understand that it's a mitzvah for a father to feed his sons, and then by inference, by kavachomer, we learn that the daughters also, because of dishonor. If he doesn't feed his daughters and they have to go around begging, that's much more demeaning for a girl to have to go around and beg than for a boy. And so if he has to feed his boys, all the more so he has to feed his girls. But otherwise it's the same conclusion, that's mitzvah for both and no chiyuv for either. So he also can't be the author, because our inference said that there's a chiyuv for a father to feed his sons, and he says only a mitzvah. The third opinion is Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka omer chova lazon et habanot lachar mitat avihen ava bechayavihen elu va'elu enan nizonin. He says that the obligation to feed daughters is only after the father dies, as the Mishnah said. That's the clause in the Mishnah, in the Ketubot, that says they have to feed his daughters. Habanot yizonu, as Eliezer ben Azariah derived from that. That's only after he dies and she gets fed from the estate. But while the father is alive, not the sons and not daughters, neither of them have an obligation, and sounds like not even a mitzvah. So So you see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka was way too lenient, at least on the obligations of the father, to be the author of this Mishnah, because the author of this Mishnah says he has an obligation, a chiyuv for sons, and mitzvah for daughters, and he's during his lifetime. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says neither. All right, so now nobody can be the author of this Mishnah, so we have a big problem. Incidentally, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, in other Tannaitic sources, doesn't say what he says here. He says the opposite. But at least this is the form that the Bavli has of this Baraita. And so now the Gemara will summarize its argument. Mane matnitin. Once again, it asks the question, who is the author? Rabbi Meir ha'amar banim mitzvah. If it's Rabbi Meir, but Rabbi Meir says that there's only a mitzvah for sons, and we infer that has to be a chiyuv for sons. Rabbi Yehuda ha'amar banim nameh mitzvah. If it's Rabbi Yehuda, he said that sons also have a mitzvah, not only daughters. And so, again, the same problem as for Rabbi Meir. We said that there's a chiyuv for mitzvah, a chiyuv for sons, and he says only a mitzvah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, afilu mitzvah namileka. Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka says there's not even a mitzvah for daughters, and not even for sons. So he is too far the other way. So this is a problem that nobody can be the author. All right, so now the Gemara is going to do something fantastic and say, while right now we're in crisis mode and we're all at the edge of our seats in suspense because nobody can be the author of our Mishnah, now the Gemara is going to answer and says, Ibet emar Rabbi Meir, Ibet emar Rabbi Yehuda, Ibet emar Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. You know what? If you want, I'm going to go ahead and turn around and explain this Mishnah according to any of the opinions, all of the opinions. It could be Rabbi Meir, and if you want, I'll explain it according to Rabbi Yehuda. If you want, I'll explain it even according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. I think you see the powerful rhetoric in this Mishnah, in this sugya. You can imagine it being a live presentation of the rabbi to his students there, and he's building up this argument, and everybody is all in suspense. Wow, it can't be anyone. And then he makes the opposite argument, and this would really be very educational about how to make an argument on both sides, kind of like a debating team, but also persuasive. Because by clearing the slate and saying can't be anybody, that's going to make it the audience more open to accepting that it can be any of the three, as we'll see. Now, so it can be to be me'ir. How so? Hachika amar. So you know what the two inferences that we started with? Those are not really necessary. Maybe what the Mishnah means is follows: Ha'av eno chaya bimzonot bito, vehu adin libno. The Mishnah just said that a father is not obligated to feed his daughter, and the truth is, there's no chiyuv for him to feed his sons either. Against the first inference that for his son he has a chiyuv. No. Ha mitzvah bebito ika. But for his daughter, there is in fact a mitzvah, the second inference we're keeping. And kal vachomed labanim, and all the more so for sons. So the father does have a mitzvah for daughters, and there's also kal vachomed for sons because they learn Torah. V'hadekatani bito. So how come the Mishnah didn't mention sons if there's a mitzvah also for sons? Hakamash ma'lan tafilu bito hovahu deleka ha mitzvah ika. Mention daughter specifically because you might have thought that for a daughter maybe there's an obligation. So it wants to tell you that no, there's no obligation for his daughter. But there is at least a mitzvah. And since the primary thing that the Mishnah has to teach is for a daughter, that the daughter has no chiyuv, but there is a mitzvah. And only once we know the daughter has a mitzvah, from there we learn a kal vachomer to sons, since they learn Torah, so all the more so they have a mitzvah. That's why it specified daughter. Okay, so we can in fact read the Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir. It mentioned only daughter, even though the same is true for a son, that there's no chiyuv. And it only had to mention daughter because all the more so a son, if there's no obligation for him to feed his daughter, for whom it's dishonorable to have to go and beg, then all the more so he's not going to have to feed his sons. So that's this inference is instead of the inference number 1 that we started with. Ha mitzvah bibno ika. But now that we know there's no mitzvah, that there's no obligation for the son, we can infer that it's used the word chiyuv to teach us that there is a mitzvah. It is a good deed for a father to feed his son. And from there, we get a kavachomer to daughters, since it would be more dishonorable for them to have to go beg. And the reason why it specified the daughter is to teach me that for the daughter, there's not even any chovah, even though it would be dishonorable for her to beg. Nevertheless, don't think that there is any obligation. There's zero absolute obligation, but and there's no obligation for a son either, but there's a mitzvah for a son, and therefore also kavachomer, a mitzvah for a daughter. All right, so now we're able to reconcile the Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, which means that our Mishnah, according to these readings, says that there is a mitzvah for a father to feed his son and his daughter. Now we go to the third possibility. אינו חייב במזונות ביתו, והוא הדין לבנו, והוא הדין דאפילו מצווה נמי לקה, והייתי דבנות אחר מיתת אביהן חובה, תנא נמי אינו חייב. We can read the Mishnah easily according to Yochanan ben Beroka, and in fact, this is the easiest to read. The Peshat of the Mishnah is exactly to be Yochanan ben Beroka. A father is not obligated to feed his daughter, and neither is he obligated to feed his son. And in fact, there's no mitzvah even at all. It doesn't mention anything about a mitzvah. It doesn't say anything about a mitzvah. And since for daughters, it's talking about after once the father dies, then the estate is in fact obligated to feed the daughters. So that's why it says there's no chiyuv. That's why it specified daughters that there's no chiyuv, so that we would know, after death there is an obligation to feed the daughters, but when he's alive, no, there's no obligation. And certainly no obligation for sons, which is a different story altogether. The sons, after the death of the father, would not be fed by the estate, because they would inherit the estate. They would inherit the amount of Ketubot, and together with all sons would inherit the estate, so they don't have to be fed from it. Okay, so we see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, who says there's no obligation and no mitzvah to feed daughters during the father's lifetime, that's in fact exactly word for word what the Mishnah said. So this whole sugya is going around a roundabout way to conclude what it could have said simply. Really, a simple reading would have been just to say, who is the author of this Mishnah? And it could have said, Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, period. Why doesn't it do that? Why is it giving us this whole, first say, no, it can't be anybody, and then say it can be all three, instead of the straightforward interpretation that it's simply the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka? I think the answer is that if it just said that, straightforward answer, then the Mishnah would have concluded, our interpretation of the Mishnah would have been that a father has no obligation, not even the mitzvah, to feed his sons or daughters. And this is morally untenable. And therefore, the author of the sugya, whoever presented this, whoever taught the sugya, preferred that the halacha follow Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda, who, even though there's no obligation, at least there's a mitzvah to feed his sons and daughters. And so it wants to try to fit the wording of the Mishnah together into the opinion of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. So what's the most successful, and it does that. What's the most successful way persuasively to do that? It's first to say, you know what, this Mishnah can't be according to anybody. So now we're in crisis mode. We're at the edge of our seats. What do you mean? It can't be according to anybody. And then, only then, we give the possibility that yes, it can be according to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, or it could also be Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. So at that point, we're more willing to accept the explanation of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And so this is a much better morally proper conclusion that it can in fact be any of these opinions. If you're interested, I wrote a article about this sugya and others like it that talk about authorship and find a way of interpreting a Mishnah not according to its simple reading, but according to another reading. I think we can find support for this methodology in something that Rav Shira Gaon wrote that says when the Yehuda Nasi saw to prefer one view, and the later rabbis that came after him did not see to prefer that view, they wanted halakha to be against the view that the Yehuda Nasi taught, they explained it in such a way that they would not have to rely on it. So they would explain away the Mishnah in a different way. For example, Rabbi taught a minority view anonymously because it made sense to him that the Chashid should follow that view, and that is what Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is doing here. He has the Mishnah be anonymous and follow the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. But it did not make sense to later rabbis. They will tell you that it follows Rabbi, or they would teach it as a minority view, and we do not practice according to it. So sometimes the Gemara says, this Mishnah is a da'at yachid. What it does here is a slightly different approach, but gets to the same conclusion and says, this Mishnah, I know it looks like it follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka and has no reason, no obligation on the father at all, but I'm going to show you that actually we can give another interpretation of the Mishnah, and in fact it could follow the other two opinions who are halachically and morally preferable. All right, we see the structure of the sugya also, I analyzed there, follows a beautiful structure of a presentation of a thesis, and then following, I'm going to say three things, and then it explains those three things and repeats the thesis, kind of like a well-structured essay that people write today. So this is really a very beautiful and very interesting sugya. All right, this idea that the rabbis were bothered by the morality of a father not having an obligation to feed his daughters comes up explicitly in the following stories. Amar Rabbi Il'a, Amar Resh Lakish Mishum Rabbi Yehuda bar Hanina, Beusha itkinu shehadam zan et banav et benotav keshehem ketanim. When the Sanhedrin left Yavneh and went northward to Usha, the rabbis there made a takana. They established an obligation that a father has to feed his sons and his daughters when they are children until they become adults. Which means that before Usha, in times of the Mishnah, there was not an obligation. And so Usha, they said, this is a problem. There's too many deadbeat fathers. We have to institute this absolute legal obligation. So the rabbis asked, does the halacha follow this takana, or did it catch on and it's a real takana, or does the halacha not follow it? Maybe they tried to do it, but they couldn't get everyone on board, and so it did not take effect. Tashema ki hava atu lekamed Rav Yehuda amar lehu yarod yalda ve'abene mata shadya. So here's a couple of stories. The first story is that one time some people came to Rav Yehuda to complain about this guy. He's a father and he's not sustaining his children. And Rav Yehuda would say to them, a jackal bears offspring and he leaves it for others the obligation to feed them. In other words, even a jackal bird feeds its young, and this father is worse than a jackal, right? He gives birth to, he has children, and he leaves it to the residents of the town to have to collect charity funds to support his own children. The point is that Rav Yehuda is publicly shaming him, and he's announcing what a terrible guy. Everybody know this guy, right? He does not take care of his children. So what we see here is that this takana did not take effect. If it did take effect, then he would have the authority to go and seize his assets to pay for it. But he can't do that. All he can say is that this guy is a real lowlife, and he can let everybody know he's a lowlife. Maybe by shaming him, the guy will come around. כי אהבה עטו לקמד רב חיסטה, אמר להו, כפו לעשיתה בסיבורה. Lekum lema urba ba'e bene, ve'u gabra la ba'e bene. A similar case came before Rav Chista. They said to his father, he's not taking care of his daughters. So he says, turn a mortar over, the bottom of a big mill, and stand up on it in the middle of the square, and let someone come and say, even a raven wants to feed his sons. This guy does not feed his sons. So he's even, again, publicly shaming him that he doesn't take care of his young. Okay, so again, we see that he didn't have the takana in place that he can go and take the assets. He had to, but he did announce that he'd be publicly shamed. Now we ask a question. By the way, ravens, do they actually care about their young? Do they take care and feed their young? The pasuk in the Hallelujahs at the end of Tehillim say, Hashem, you're so great because you take care of the raven who calls to you. Why does the baby raven have to call to you? Because the parents don't take care of it. So I thought that ravens are not taken care of. Well, it depends what kind of ravens. Depends if they're the white ones or the black ones. It may refer to two different species, or it may refer to development. When they're babies, they're white, and parents don't take care of them because they don't know if they're healthy enough to even survive. Why, if they survive past infancy, then they turn black, and then the parents do take care of them because they're healthy. Okay, so we resolved that. Another story. Amar le nichalach de mitazene banecha misedaka. An incident of this kind came before Rava, a deadbeat father, and Rava said to the father, you're okay with that? That your sons are going to be sustained through charity, and you're not going to support them? So you see three cases where the rabbis could shame the father, but we're not able to extract funds. Now this fact that we say that the court does not have the power to take the funds of the father by force, that is only if the father is not wealthy. But if he is wealthy and he has the funds, then we do go again and coerce him against his will, take the money and use it to feed his daughters. For example, one time Rava had to go and forcibly take tzedakah funds, a lot of money, 400 zuz, from Rav Natan bar Ameh, who was not paying his obligation, his share of the tax that everyone had to pay for charity. So in the case of a deadbeat father, not calling Rav Natan necessarily a deadbeat father himself, but rather he just wasn't paying his tzedakah share. But the same would be for a father who was wealthy and not feeding, so his sons, his daughters. So also, we could feed them from the charity funds. And even if it was someone else's daughter, if someone is wealthy, we would go to the wealthy guy who didn't pay his share of tzedakah, and we would forcibly take it from him. So all the more so, we'll go and forcibly take from him funds to feed his own daughters who are poor because their father isn't taking care of them. So therefore, from the law of tzedakah, we can coercively seize his property, even though we couldn't do that just because of a takana or any law that actually requires the father to do so. So therefore, if the father himself is poor, and therefore we could not take further charity from him, but if he's rich, we could take charity from him. That's the end of this subject. If you just want to see what the outline looks like, you see that it starts off with a narration of the case and then partition. Who's the author? And it says it's not any of them. And then it brings the proof, actually brings the Braita, and then what's called in Greco-Roman sources a peroration, going back and saying who's the author, and fully explains each of the different opinions, which is just like a kind of 5-paragraph essay that we learn in writing today, where the introduction, you say the thesis, and I'm going to prove it from 3 points, and then you have 3 paragraphs proving each of the 3 points, and then you have a conclusion that summarizes everything together. That 5-paragraph essay actually goes back to Greco-Roman handbooks of persuasive speaking. And you see the Talmud, and this sugya at least, follows a very similar structure, which means that the rabbis, when they wanted to persuade their audiences of a certain halacha, would use the best persuasive techniques around, which anyone who heard any public lectures in the town square would have picked up on those very same techniques. And if you're interested in reading more about that, you can send me an email. I'm happy to send you this chapter. All right, now that we mentioned one of the institutions that was made at Usha, we're going to mention a second one. Amar Rabbi Il'a Amar Resh Lakish Be'usha hitkinu HaKotev kol nechasav lebanav hu v'ishto nizonim mehen. If someone transfers all of his property as a gift to his sons while he's alive, nevertheless he and his wife can be sustained from that property, even though he gave it away. I mean, this happens even today sometimes. Someone retires and he gifts his business or his house or his all of his property to his sons. The sons will take care of it from now on, with the expectation that the sons will provide for their father and mother, or their father and his wife, whatever they need. So that's a good expectation, unless if there's some tension or some problem, and now all of a sudden the sons say, no, we don't want to pay for this and that, and they stop taking care of their father. Does the father have legal recourse to force them to pay to sustain him and his wife? And so in Usha, they made a takana. Yes, the children have to take care of their father and his wife for their lifetimes from the gift that he gave them in the first place. Now, question: Matkif la Rabbi Zera v'item Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani gedola mizo amru almana nizonet min nechasav hu ve'ishto miba'ya. Says, why did they have to make a takana? That means that the law was not so beforehand. We have an even greater law that says an almana, a person's widow, has to be sustained from his property, meaning even after he dies and his sons inherit his property, his widow, which is either the son's mother or their stepmother, they have to provide for her. So if that's true after the father dies, then isn't that all the more so while the father is alive, and this actually was his own property, that he can make his estate pay for the needs of him and his wife? Do you even have to make such a takana? Now, further proof, the Shalach Ravin Be'i Garte. One time Ravin sent a letter to Bavel, and in the letter he wrote, this is interesting because it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, but you see it's being written down. Probably some of the earliest Torah Sheba'al Peh being written down before it was actually written down is in the form of letters. It would be nice if we could find some of these letters one day. Mi shemet v'iniach almana ubat, almanato nizonet minechasav. Niset habat, almanato nizonet minechasav. If a man dies leaving only a wife and a daughter, he has no sons. So now what's going to happen to his estate? Well, it's going to go to the daughter, interestingly, not his wife. The daughter will inherit it like Benos Solof Chad. So what happened? Who's going to take care of the widow for the rest of her life? So Almanaton Nizonim Nechasav, the estate has to provide food for the widow, as long as she's alive. Now, and the daughter, well, she inherits the estate, so she has no problem. She has the money of the estate. What if she gets married? Nisetabat. Now, when she gets married, that property that she brought into the marriage will be controlled by her husband, who can enjoy the fruit of the property while they're married. So how about then? Then also the widow has a right to be sustained from his property, the husband of the daughter, which could be her son-in-law, but not necessarily. It could be a stepmother. Okay, now meta habat we're continuing in the read this letter. What if that daughter dies? So if the daughter dies, the property gets inherited by her husband, and so now there is actually no family link between the husband, who inherited the property from his wife, who inherited the property from her father. But if that almana is still alive, no, even then, what's the case? Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Achoto shel Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina al yadi haya maaseh. And he says, this happened to me. V'amru almanato nizonit minechasav. Yes, in fact, the widow still has a right to be sustained from the property that was now inherited by the father's daughter's husband, right? Even though it's totally out of the family now, nevertheless, she retains that right. Okay, all that is background for the question, Hu vishto mi ba'ya? If that's true, that a widow is sustained even from an estate that was inherited and re-inherited and out of the family, and she still has a right to it, then all the more so, you don't even need to tell me that when the father is actually alive, that he gifted his estate to his sons, that his wife would have to be sustained from that while he's alive. So how come they even have to make a takana about this in Usha? Why do they have to say so? And the answer is, no, in those cases where the father died, so now there's no one to work on behalf of the almana. And women usually could not get jobs and did not have access to their own income or property, and so there's no one that's going to work. So in that case, yes, the inheritance has to sustain the almana. But in this case, when the father is actually alive and he gifted it to his sons with the expectation and hopefully they'd be nice and feed him, but if they're not, maybe we would say there's no legal obligation because let him go back to work. And then he could provide for himself and for his wife. So Kamash Malan, therefore, the ordinance at Usha teaches us that the father can insist that the gift that he gave of his estate, that he gave to his sons, continue to pay for him and his wife, even though it's out of their hands. All right, just like we asked about the previous Takanav Usha, does the halacha actually follow this or not? Tashemad Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yochanan, Havu Kaime Ata Hahu Gabra. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yonatan were standing together, and a certain guy came along. Gachin unshakel Rabbi Yochanan akareh, and he bent down and he kissed Rabbi Yonatan on his foot. So this is surprising. Well, it doesn't happen every second. Amar le Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Chanina standing beyond Yonatan says, what happened? Who's this guy? How come he is so grateful to you that he's kissing your feet? Well, this happened exactly this case, that he gifted all of his property over to his sons. And then the sons didn't want to take care of their father, and the case came before me, and I forced the sons to feed the father. That's why he's so grateful. Okay, from this story we can learn, if the law does not follow the Takanav Usha, that means that the sons did not have an absolute legal obligation to feed the father, and nevertheless Yonatan ruled that they have to. That's why he's so grateful, because this guy was going to be left with nothing. But if that was the letter of the law, that the halacha was like the Takanav Usha, then why would he be so grateful, right? He wouldn't even need to force the sons. That would be the straightforward halacha. So the guy wouldn't be so grateful that he'd go down and kiss Rabbi Yonatan's feet. So from this story, we learn that Rabbi Yonatan went above and beyond the law and forced them to, but that was not strictly the letter of the law. And so just like in the previous case, in this case also, the sages at Usha saw a need for such a thing, but their takana was never accepted as halacha l'maaseh, and we'll see more takanot from Usha on the next stuff. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.